Hello, America, and good day to our friends around the world. This is a political talk show on WRMN. That's WRMN 1410 AM and WRMN 1410.com. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part of the show. My name is Dennis Green. I am the host and moderator of a political talk show on WRMN, Monday through Friday, 4 to 6. A political talk show strives to be that in between. We don't want to choose a side. We don't want to put on a jersey and root for one particular party or the other. We want to root for America and the values in the Constitution. So in this series of videos and podcasts and audio and radio shows, we're going to go over the Constitution itself. Each one of these segments, each one of these shows is about 20 minutes long or so, and we're going to go over an individual part of the Constitution. This one today is going to be all about why and how we got to the Constitution. We'll go through the articles of the Confederation. We will also go through all of the oppression and the different acts, the intolerable acts that the British Parliament had put on the colonies. We'll even go into the Philadelphia Convention, and we'll go into the philosophical foundations between people who were the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, all leading up to what we have now in the United States, the U.S. Constitution. The next one after this, if you want to watch everything in order or listen to everything in order, the next one will be the Constitution itself and go right into Article 1. So first, let's lay down the groundwork and what they did, those founding fathers, and what was the foundation. What were the steps? They didn't all of a sudden come up with the Constitution. They didn't wake up one day and say, we're going to spend the next couple of years putting together this Constitution and go. They started the nation already, so they had to have something that was there as laws, part of bringing about the Constitution and having all of these things ratified was the fact that the new birth of the nation didn't have the functions that a normal nation would have. It couldn't collect taxes efficiently. It couldn't enter treaties because essentially it was 13 different pieces that every once in a while they agreed on something, but they all had their own stuff, which is where inflation and everything else started to grow. So they needed to form a constitution. But before the Constitution, there was confusion, disunity, fragility. The United States had declared independence in 1776, but a functional national government remained elusive. The Constitution of 1787 was not just a legal document, it was a radical solution to the growing crisis. We're going to talk about the foundational problems in the early republic and the motivations behind the Constitutional Convention, the philosophical, the political, the practical, all of the different imperatives that shaped the final document. So let's first get into the Articles of the Confederation. This was the loose alliance that had came about after the Declaration of Independence. The first Constitution of the United States, the Articles of the Confederation, was ratified in 1781. So it was even years after that Declaration of Independence that was there. But it created a firm league of friendship among the sovereign states. Each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and the National Congress had no power to tax or regulate commerce or even enforce those federal level laws. So there was no executive branch, there was no judiciary, and every single amendment required unanimous consent and there was no power to compel the states to contribute revenue or troops. The kindness of their hearts to give money to the federal government or then supply troops in case something happened. George Washington wrote to James Madison, "We are one nation today and 13 tomorrow. Who will treat with us on such terms?" He wrote that to James Madison in 1785 because nobody would jump into a treaty with 13 different nations that were essentially 13 nations in a trench coat. The nation's government was essentially impotent. Interstate disputes festered, the economy suffered under uncoordinated trade policies and that inflation, and sovereign powers questioned the viability of the republic. Most alarmingly, the uprising like Shays' Rebellion in 1876 underscored the inability of the Confederation Congress to maintain domestic order. Americans' aversion to a centralized power was deeply rooted in their colonial experience. You got to think about this. They had just gotten their freedom from an oppressive government. They didn't want to give another government more power. They wanted to keep it at the local level. Their political culture was shaped by a century of tension with British imperial authority, culminating in that American Revolution. The Articles were deliberately weak, reflecting a desire to avoid any appearance of recreating that monarchy. And what were they afraid of? Well, under the British oppression, the Acts of Parliament and the colonies fought back. The founders' concerns were not abstract. They were born from decades of lived experience under what they saw as arbitrary British rule. There was the Stamp Act, which imposed direct taxes on paper goods, seen as a taxation, again without representation. That was in 1765. 2 years later, in 1767, was the Townshend Act, which taxed everyday items like glass, paper, and even tea. And then, of course, the Tea Act again put more tax on the tea in 1773, granted the British East India Company a monopoly. And that Tea Act was what led to the Boston Tea Party. Then in 1774, the Coercive Acts, also called the Intolerable Acts, closed the Boston Harbor and revoked Massachusetts' self-government. They weren't too happy about that Tea Party. Colonists feared a centralized authority because they had seen its abuse. Quartering of soldiers, unfair taxation, restrictions on assembly, and lack of judicial independence. These experiences hardened the revolutionary commitment to local governance and civil liberties. James Otis, a Massachusetts lawyer and early patriot, said in 1764, "Government without representation is slavery." Thus, the early American political order, embodied in the Articles, that intentionally decentralized. But that same decentralization policy proved unsustainable because it didn't give anybody any teeth. It didn't give the federal government really any power for the states to really do anything. They still relied on that volunteer type of mentality. And now comes along the Philadelphia Convention. In 1887, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island abstained, they all gathered in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. Almost immediately, the task shifted from revision to replacement. The secrecy of the proceedings reflected the magnitude and fragility of their endeavor. Again, people did not want a federal government that had control, but they also did not want a nation that couldn't function. And that's where the anti-federalists eventually lost their side, even though they fought, a lot of them, in the revolution. Patrick Henry is one of the ones that come to mind for me, being an anti-federalist. But there wasn't this big swell of let's give the government more power. That's why the Federalists wrote the Federalist Papers. But the key players of that Philadelphia Convention, George Washington, James Madison from Virginia, Alexander Hamilton from New York, and Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania. From Benjamin Franklin himself, the situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, resembles the builders of Babel. Because so many different local entities wanted to have control over their own local sovereignty. That's why, in essence, we are called the United States. The states have come together to govern over their own sovereignty, and then those states all agree to have federal governance over them, is how the original framework was put together. This is where we get the Great Compromise. The bicameral legislature balancing large and small states. The 3/5 compromise was put in there as well, and the Electoral College. The driving concern was the threat of disunion and foreign intervention. You would think with all of the chaos, either the French or at the time, I'm sure, Spain was also sailing around that area. And we've also just left British rule. And we no longer colonies, so Britain was a foreign nation. Without a stronger central government, the American experiment in self-government appeared doomed. During this time, this was also the time of Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment influence were from people that weren't necessarily American. The Constitution drew heavily from enlightened thinkers like John Locke, of the ideas of just natural rights, God-given rights, Montesquieu's separation of powers, Rousseau's societal contract, and just classical Republican ideas that shaped the debates. There was a lot of talk about Rome itself and the Greek philosophers inside. I mean, you got to think about it. That's what they all had, was just the classical literature. They didn't have any of the new thinkers now. They didn't have the new foreign leaders that were there. They were people who were classically trained because that's what the information was available. And what they chose was chose republicanism over democracy. The founders distrusted pure democracy. Benjamin Franklin even more so. Instead, they sought to establish a republic. And a republic is different from a democracy. A republic is a system of government based on popular sovereignty, and it's filtered through representative institutions and checks and balances. A republic is a group of people that agree on the laws and the rule of law. They use democracy to get representation within that republic. Because this was the fear the fear of tyranny. They couldn't give the entire government everything because the founders distrusted all of the power under a monarchy that they just left, and they weren't going to hand over into a pure democracy everybody that was there. Instead, they sought to establish a republic and sought to design a system that avoided all forms of tyranny. Hence, the separation of powers, the legislative, executive, and judicial, which takes it back to the Roman Empire. Federalism as well, dividing the power between states and national government. Give the states the power in the national side to do national treaties, run a national army, collect national taxes, and still have the state sovereignty take care of everything else. And a written constitution that limited and defined authority, that said this is how long they get to rule, this is how they will be ruled, and these will be the checks and balances. The memory of Oliver Cromwell's dictatorship during England's brief Republican interlude and the corruption of Parliament under King George III reinforced the need for institutional checks. The goal was not just to empower, but to contain that power. So the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists debate over this, over the new Constitution, and it was fierce. The Federalists, including Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, they supported ratification, arguing that the new system corrected the weaknesses of the Articles. The Anti-Federalists, including Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Albridge Gerry, referred to centralized power and the absence of explicit protections for individual rights. We've got to look at the Constitution when it was first put together without the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights came afterwards, shortly thereafterwards, but those 10 articles were not in the original drafting, which is why the Anti-Federalists were so mad about it. And state sovereignty only got an Article 4. And we'll get into that when we get into the articles. But because it was lacking, that's where we got the 10th Amendment to also ensure states' sovereignty. The Federalist Papers, they published anonymously under the pseudonym Publius. These 85 essays defended the Constitution's principles and anticipated objections. They remained essential to understanding the original intent of the framers and are still pulled up today. From James Madison in Federalist number 10, it has been remarked that a pure democracy can admit no cure for the mischiefs of faction. And so this is where we get the living Constitution. There's durability in the Constitution by design. It is not the end all be all always. It is adaptable. The amendment process laid out in Article 5, it says necessary and proper for the general welfare and the authority of the judicial interpretation have allowed the document to evolve. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, I think is Patrick Henry. He also said the Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people. It is an instrument for the people to restrain the government. The lessons from the Anti-Federalists and the people that wanted to keep the Articles Liberty requires structure. Otherwise, you have an anarchy. And the government must be powerful enough to govern, but limited enough to prevent oppression. The other side that I think we seem to lose nowadays is compromise is not weakness. It is the foundation of constitutional order. That's why we have checks and balances, is the compromise side. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice of the Supreme Court, said the framers left us a constitution adaptable to the needs of an ever-expanding we the people. Thurgood Marshall, also a Supreme Court justice and civil rights advocate, said the true miracle was not the Constitution of 1787, but the progress made sense. The Constitution was born out of necessity, shaped by history and guided by ideals that were both ambitious and imperfect. It replaced dysfunction with a coherent framework. But more than that, it offered a new vision of government. One accountable to the people, constrained by law, and open to amendment and renewal. This series in the Constitution, we are going to get through each article. We are going to go through each amendment so that we understand the blueprint of the Constitution. We want to make sure that the things that we talk about and the things that we give up the rule of law to, we understand. If this is the law of the land, if this is what many people in the military and our political leaders swear an oath to, we should probably understand it. You can find the series on WRMN's YouTube page. WRMN Radio is a place to go for that. You can also find it podcasted on Apolitical Talk Show's podcast feed. It'll be mixed in between other episodes as it's released there. But the full playlist will live on WRMN's YouTube channel, so head on over there. This is a political talk show on our constitutional series. Stick around. We've got more apolitical talk show and more constitutional talk coming up just around the corner. My name is Dennis Green. Thank you.